Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, the channel where we are making a computer role-playing game using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In fantasy-themed games, the differences between different monsters is usually very important. So when you're learning to play the game or when you're hearing about the game from other people, you will often hear talk along the lines of, well, if you're using this kind of magic, remember that vampires are immune to them, and with frost giants, they do this, so therefore you're going to need this, etc., etc. Whereas in the game that I'm making, the main game that I'm making, the differences are cosmetic. Each group of monsters has its own description, and the descriptions are quite different, but that doesn't have any effect on the chances of different things happening. So I wasn't satisfied with that, and so I've decided to fix that, or change it, to differentiate the monsters somewhat. So I'll show you what that looks like in play first, and then I'll go through some of the code. It won't be necessary to look at all the code. So let's be a troll, and we're going to wander around until we find some... There we go. So we see a settlement up ahead. The denizens resemble the offspring of owls and beetles with long rat-like tails. Now, this is the interesting part, or the new part. It says, quirk are so keen-eyed that nothing escapes their notice save a dwarf's cloak. Now, in the real game, you wouldn't get that. You would have to sort of discover it. I've just put that in so I can test that things are working as they should be. So let's try and test this. So the quirk is they're so keen-eyed that nothing escapes their notice except a dwarf's cloak. So let's try and sneak through without being seen, which normally wouldn't work anyway because my size is quite large and my dex is pretty average. But so let's see what happens. Okay, now normally you would expect a red... roughly this colour, in fact exactly that colour, bit of text that says we were rolling against dexterity minus size and we rolled such and such and we got the total. And we noticed that we don't have that. We didn't even get to roll, which shows that the quirk is behaving as it should do. Now, of course, in this case, it wouldn't matter much because given the stats that we have, we probably wouldn't try and sneak through. But for perhaps an elf or a dwarf, it would be quite relevant. So that's an example of how it works. Let's now have a look at the code. So what I've done is we have these... we have the array BF. We already had this array, which is the basic format for monster descriptions. So they are H with the heads of A, which means something from the human-like list with the heads of something from the animal-like list. So they might be, children with the heads of wolves or something like that. H from the waist up, A from the waist down, very similar. Disembodied floating heads of E, which means that can be either human or animal. The offspring of humans and some animal, etc. And what I've done is I've decided to have in the underworld there will be as many species as there are these basic formats. One of each. So there'll be one species which is a human, something human with the heads of something animal, and so on. And that ensures that it's just a very simple way to ensure that no two species will have the same description. Random chance won't ever create exactly the same description, because even if we had the same entry for H and the same entry for A, children with the heads of animals is different from children from the waist up. Let's say children with the heads of beetles is different from children from the waist up, beetles from the waist down, right? For example, or beetles with the heads of children. So how do we do this? Well, we have the array CD, which is creature description, and then we have somewhere down here sorry, I didn't put it in particularly. Here we go, right. Then we have a Q array, which is a numerical array, which is the quirks of the different species. Then we have QD, which is text descriptions of the quirks. That's the stuff that came up when it said quirk is are so keen-eyed, or that nothing escapes their notice, etc. So I'll list the ones. So we've got never defeated in battle except by the spell. Nothing escapes their notice, so you can't sneak or steal from them if you're trading, unless you can sneak with the dwarf's cloak, but otherwise you can't. If you loot one of their settlements, the treasure that you'll get will always be magic. And then these four are quite similar. They despise humility, loathe formality, and take great offence at arrogance. You might remember when you approach a settlement, you have four options for your approach. It can be humble, informal, formal, or arrogant. And each of these quirks just means that you can only get, at best, a result of they tell you to leave. You can only either get they attack you or they tell you to leave. If you get something higher, it'll just move it down to that if you've used the approach that they dislike. Obviously, there's lots more quirks that I could add. These were just the ones that sort of came to my mind at the start. So then we have a for loop, and the number that we're going up to is bf.length minus 1. You'll remember that bf is the basic formats for monster descriptions. So set q, or set $q, square bracket $z, n square bracket equals random, bracket 1, comma, $qd.length minus 1, end bracket. In other words, the set the slot of the Q array relating to species number Z to be some random number between 1 and however many entries there are in this QD array. Which does mean that two different species can have the same quirk just by random chance. There's nothing, I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. So every species should have a quirk, and every species will have a monster description. I won't go through this code because I've gone through it before. Just to quickly say, it's now a for loop, and it goes from 1 to, again, bf length minus 1, because there's one species for every basic format for the description. It starts with the bf entry for that particular array, and then it randomly fills in what the details are, adds some extra quirks at the end, such as beards or weird eyes, or etc., etc. And then finally sets the relevant slot in the CD array, creature description array, to be the text that it's been manipulating through those pages. When we get to a new settlement, or when we return to an old settlement, let's look at find. It'll give us this. This is the bit that's testing only. It tells us the quirk. This is a bit complicated because MO, that array used to be a text description because each settlement had its own species, but now all it is a number. from 1 to bf.length. So it just says if it might just be 3 or 2 or whatever, and that just refers to species 3. So it's a fairly complicated thing. It looks at MOCXCY, which is a number. It looks at Q of that number. So what is the quirk? Let's say MOCXCY is 3. It'll say, okay, let's look at Q3. In other words, what's the quirk of species 3? And that might be 7. And it'll say, okay, well then we print QD 7. So the 7th quirk description. Obviously, in the real game, this will all be deleted. And the way that we code the quirks working is different for different quirks, of course, because they apply at different stages of the approach. So, for example, let's say we want to sneak in, and we would end up on the page sneak. Well, that will say include sneak roll, which is this other page. So this first bit is if we have the dwarf's cloak spell, but here we have the relevant bit. The way it works is you roll, it sets RR, which is the result of the roll, to 0, but then it says if you've got SL6 equal to 1, in other words, if you have a dwarf's cloak, then you have the option to make a spell roll, and if you get over 20, then you have succeeded in operating, making the dwarf's cloak hide you. And what it used to say was just, if RR is less than 21, well then you get a sneak roll as well. Why if RR is under 21? Well, because if your dwarf's cloak works, you don't need to make a roll using your dexterity and your size. The cloak has hidden you in the story of the game, whatever your size and dexterity. But now it says if RR is under 21 and this thing here, if $Q square bracket $MO square bracket $CX n square bracket $CY n square bracket exclamation mark equals, which means does not equal, 2. So what's it doing here? Well, CX and CY are your current position. $MO is the species of the creatures that are at that particular position, and then Q $MOCXCY is the quirk of the species that is at that position. So in other words, if the quirk of that species does not equal 2 and RR is under 21, then you make a sneak roll. And the reason it would say that the quirk is not equal to 2 is because when we look at QD, QD2 is they're so keen-eyed that nothing escapes their notice save a dwarf's cloak. So that is the quirk that stops you making sneak rolls, basically. And when we come to a new settlement, and that will take us to the page new settlement, obviously. MOCXCY, in other words, MO for the current location, will be a random number between 1 and bf.length minus 1, because that's how many that will choose between all of the available species. As I've said before, you'd think it'd be bf.length, but it has to be bf.length minus 1. I think the reason for that is that in computing, a lot of things count from 0. They treat the 0th slot as being the beginning, and I tend to use a more everyday kind of approach where the first one is number 1. So I think that's why you have to do $bf.length minus 1. But anyway, be that as it may, you do have to do $bf.length minus 1. So obviously the fighting one is very, very similar. It'll be a different quirk, and it'll just say if you if the species that you're fighting doesn't have that quirk, then you get to make a strength roll. And if they have that quirk, then you don't, because they're invincible. Similarly, the quirk that you always get magic. If random 1 to 2 equals 1 and the relevant quirk, again that's $Q, $MO, CXCY. If the quirk doesn't equal 3, because that's the they hoard magic quirk, then you get shells. Otherwise, if they don't have that quirk and the random numbers come up, you get spices. And otherwise, you get a either a scroll giving you a spell or a magic item. And then I'll look at one more, the approach. They're all treated in one go. And the way that works is very simple. It's a single line, which is AS is the number of your approach. So like 1 is humble and 2 is formal and 3 is informal and 4 is haughty, I think. And the quirks are in the same order. So if, and again we've got $Q, $MO, CXCY, that same formula, the quirk of the species that is at this location. If that equals AS plus 3, then Z, the final result, the policy that they'll take to you, is math.min Z, 2. In other words, it is whatever's smaller of the result as it is, or the number 2. In other words, if it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, no, move it down to 2. And that means that the best you can get is that you're told to go back, and the only other option is that they become enraged and attack you. So that is broadly how it's done. Now, you might be wondering, well, if you've got these quirks, but you're not going to be told the quirk in the game, what's the point of the quirk? What's the point of, how do you work it out except by sort of finding out, by attacking them and finding out, oh yeah, they're invincible? Is there a way of, that doesn't seem very fun. Is there a way of kind of finding out beforehand? And the answer is yes. I do intend to put in various ways of finding out the quirks, other than by sort of stumbling into them. But that is something that I'm going to deal with in the next video. So I hope that what I've showed you so far was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.